I sometimes use the term shopping texture, because on a given day, some days we want to be more efficient. Some days we want to be, we want the excuse to linger. And if you think of retail more being like the gift shop at the end of the ride, more and more the ride is going to be what the marketer or the brander or the creator has to think about. And then the shopping is a byproduct of a great ride, rather than necessarily the reason for the ride.
This is the Safari. The Safari is a tour around the consumer, brand, and retailing industry. And we have the great privilege here at my company, Traub, to really be exposed to many of the great minds of the industry who are forming and shaping the future of many different parts of the consumer, brand, and retail world. And I felt it was quite interesting for us to be able to not only learn from all of those people as we do every day, but memorialize it into a podcast, which could then be shared with many of our friends and clients and you, obviously, the listener. Welcome back to the Safari. This is Morty Singer speaking here from Traub's headquarters in New York City. And today, as I often do, I want to talk about design and spatial design and architecture. And there is nobody better probably anywhere than my old friend, Ken Nisch. He's old friend, but he's very young, and he looks very young as well. The chairman of JGA. It's one of the most important retail architecture and design firms in the country. And, Ken's customer knowledge and entrepreneurial insights have been integral part of the conceptual development and strategic image positioning of many, many retail manufacturer and brand marketers in entertainment, hospitality, traditional retail for over 40 years. Hard to believe, but you must stick around and listen to him because he has really touched so many different companies and thought about how they should present themselves, for the next 5 years. And he's done that his whole career. And I've always benefited from being able to call Ken and bounce something off of him. So let's get started. Ken Nisch, thank you so much for joining me on the Safari. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well today. It's a beautiful sunny day, and I'm enjoying the view out your window to the skyline of Manhattan. So thank you for that gift.
No, you're very welcome. Well, we are here in February of 2020 at this recording, hopefully at the tail end of a pandemic. And it sounds like there's lots of good news coming through. And there's vaccines sort of proliferating all over the world. And there's new things happening to get people excited. And we think that springtime and summertime is going to be like none before. And so hopefully it'll be springtime for retail as well. And before we get started with this whole conversation, Ken, would you mind just giving a little background of JGA and your storied history there, and then we can jump in?
Well, I've had a great opportunity in the retail space working with some legends, including Marvin, during my time as a intern or a co-op at Federated's headquarters in Cincinnati. And after that, I joke around a bit. I've had, one parking spot and 500 careers, which has taken me around the world, working with some amazing entrepreneurs, founders, creators, across really the full spectrum of retail.
And so it's interesting, your firm, and you in particular, I think, are quite unique because while, yes, you're in the design and architecture field, you have always been intellectually curious about the operations of retail. And in order to be a great designer, you kind of have to understand the plumbing of retail and how it works and how people flow through the business, how the back office works, what the staff changeovers must be. How have you felt that so let's call it academic interest in the business of the business has informed your more creative side of the business, of the industry?
I think, I think part of this working at Federated was a great education because, it was in its time, it was it was the innovator. It was the creator of new ideas. It was the benchmark. And so design really served the purpose rather than design as the purpose. but I'd probably say maybe even beyond that, I've had the opportunity to be on both public and private retail boards. And I have to say I've gotten a bit of my education sitting on the other side of the table.
Yeah.
Something I unfortunately think too often, no matter what our point of view is or expertise is, that sometimes we spend too much time on our side of the table and not enough time on the other folks' side of the table. And one of the interesting companies I remain on the board of is Spirit Halloween, that opens up 1,400 stores, hires 40,000 people, trains them, builds a business, and 90 days later packs it up and waits for the circus to come back.
And people think that pop-up is a new thing, right?
But I think it's a great example of when you see something that rotates with that level of speed, you really you see it in a broader sense. Great admiration for that whole organization.
So the role of retail has shifted, obviously through your career, but maybe exponentially in the last 5 years, and even more so in the last year. I remain a devotee of bricks and mortar retail as a complement to an omni-channel and multi-channel strategy. I even think that in this environment, coming out of this time, this pandemic that we've had, with real estate rationalization across the country, indeed the globe, having now occurred, I believe that the opportunity to have retail come to life in a very powerful fashion for brands that want to tell a story is something that everyone has talked about for the last however many years, but few have actually been able to pull off, because it was almost as if whatever they did was lost in the din of everything else going on. How do you feel the role of a store has changed throughout this past year, and where is the emphasis now?
Obviously the last year has been an interesting year, and I would argue that the who, what, and where challenges haven't really changed that much. Shopping patterns, customer journey, digital. I think the when and the how. There's been an acceleration of change. The approach of things being more hybrid and integrated than necessarily segmented has accelerated. But I think I would suggest stepping back a minute. I think rethinking about retail, not just as stores, but as hospitality, entertainment, F&B services, the environment is probably really what the store of the future is going to look like, rather than a store of the future. Mm-hmm. And I think the distinction is, if you see things, simple as what Tommy Bahama is doing with Marlin Bar, is food and hospitality a service to the shopper, or is food and hospitality a motivation or an incentivization of the shopper to come and shop as a byproduct of the activity? And I think we have to think more broadly about what a store is and what retail is, beyond just the transactional environment that stores tend to gravitate to when they don't think that way.
So you've mentioned before the concept of making stores more interesting, where the customer exists, where the customer actually wants to be. Is that sort of an elaboration of where you're going with this concept?
Yeah, I sometimes use the term shopping texture, because on a given day, some days we want to be more efficient. Some days we want to be, we want the excuse to linger. And if you think of retail more being like the gift shop at the end of the ride, more and more the ride is going to be what the marketer or the brander or the creator has to think about. And then the shopping is a byproduct of a great ride, rather than necessarily the reason for the ride. And I think that's even more so as shopping behavior, has changed during the last year. Is I think a lot of people realized I really don't have to go to certain places to do the things I thought I used to have to do only there. So that's complicated saying, like, I don't want to do what I don't want to do, and I figured out a way I don't have to do it. And so if I think of businesses like grocery, and I think of other types of repetitive, activities that I don't get reward over, why would I take my time, especially my extra time, to do those things.
And do you feel that going to the mall versus the high street, or Main Street, as we say here in America, is something that is the consumer is finding to be laborious or a chore, or are you seeing your clients increasingly choosing Main Street stores versus mall stores? Is it unchanged? How do you feel the split is happening?
Well, I think if people used to say, there's 250 places in the country that I have to be, today they may say there's 150 places I have to be. And of those 150 places, before maybe 125 of them were shopping malls, and now 75 of them are shopping malls, and 75 are what I would generally call other. Mm-hmm. And other may be a high street. It might be some type of destination community. It might be some type of event. You see what's happening with things like lifestyle shows, which are sort of I call them permanent temporary retail. And they're things that happen all the time. So much commerce has moved into places like these lifestyle or these passion events. And commerce takes place in those type of places. They're sort of like malls on wheels, for all intents and purposes. Some of the stuff that happens at Javits is a great example. Think of Comic-Con is probably more a reflection of the mall of the future than necessarily, our friends in Secaucus is the mall of the future.
So when you started out doing what you do, I believe that most CEOs saw their retail stores primarily as a distribution point, a mechanism for distribution, whereas today, increasingly, it's a canvas for transmitting brand equity. And I think that there's been a huge shift in the thinking around what the store is. I mean, today, I call it the media value of retail, right? It's a interactive billboard. And then, and by the way, you can buy product, right? Yep. And hopefully because of the former, the latter, you're selling a lot of the latter, right? You're selling a lot of product. How have you sort of felt that that truism maybe, or that shift from just being a random distribution point to being a place to educate, a place to reinforce a brand promise, reputation is repetition, to make it rich in meaning maybe, or tug on the emotional chords. I'm assuming that these days you're trying to or needing to really push the envelope on creating these memories that people talk about or Instagram about. Maybe Instagram is old-fashioned now. Maybe it's everything else, TikTok and such. But tell me how you, as an architect, have gone from the more maybe sometimes more perfunctory things of wayfinding and line of sight and stockroom to emotion. But
sort of, I guess, building on both your point and your question, if you think about so many of the retail formats that customers have voted as being successful, off price, dollar stores, big box, home, electronics, those look more like the back room than the front room of retail. And to some extent, a lot of, particularly mall retail, there was the front stock room and the back stock room. And the front stock room had better lighting and nicer materials and maybe more attractive people. But by and large, it was just a version of what was behind the wall, just a better version.
Yeah.
And I think the customer said, well, I don't necessarily want to pay the premium for that level of differentiation, but I will pay a premium in my time and my money if you give me something that is more exciting or interesting or unique, and something that is, I guess, more that allows me to make more of my mark, not just to experience your mark. And I think if you think of what's happening in concepts like Meow Wolf, I think is a great example. And what does the retail do? Something like $10,000 a foot or something like that, the shop that's at the end of this. I think commerce retail will be more attached to experiences rather than be the experience in itself. And if the retailer doesn't want to get lost, they have to get in the experience game, not just in the transaction game. So if I think of experiential brands that our friends like in an Urban Outfitter or an Anthropology, they're perennial, favorites in the design community because they allow the space to be made more fresh daily, localized. You see the hand of humanity. It's implicit versus explicit. You don't see signs that tell you what you should think. You get a sense of emotion that tells you how you might want to think. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then the commerce comes at the end of that rather than at the beginning. But otherwise, why not shop online?
Yeah. So there are probably, I know you're very well traveled in every sense of the word, but let's start with the sense of the word that is traveled across retail, across the pantheon of retail, and not just retail, but, other points of sale across industries, whether it be the automotive industry, the fitness industry. Are you inspired by other industries? I often think about the opportunities that the fitness companies would have had pre-pandemic to sort of merge in some way with the active lifestyle companies so that, Lululemon, even though they do this to some extent, and I think Nike also does this to some extent, but would actually, the destination of a Nike or Lululemon at scale would be to go exercise, to go to a gym, and then the store would be attached, or the mega store would be attached. But one doesn't seem to see that. Have you found, other than some flagshipy type instances, that there are areas or industries or concepts that have been able to do the merging of the activity and the selling of product in a way that is truly scalable?
Scalable is an interesting question because, success historically was that I could have 800 of these. And I think there's kind of a reassessment saying, do I really have 4 ideas that I have 200 that add up to 800 rather than I have 800 of the same idea? And I think this will ultimately be the measure of the future successful companies. Are they a great incubator and creator and leverager of new ideas and thinking? And they're able to take their operational skills and apply them across multiple ideas, or are they only good at duplicating things?
Well, let's talk about new ideas, right? So Starbucks, one could argue, was the first WeWork, right? They sold coffee and gave you space in exchange to hang out, right? And then WeWork kind of did the reverse, and they both have had their own various measures of success, I would say. But I think that retail hospitality, the idea that there's so much space, and when you walk into these temples, these stores, there's nothing going on in there. You hear the tinny music. You have 3 people, whistling Dixie, waiting for people to come into the store. You have, hundreds of thousands of dollars of inventory sort of hanging loosely on racks. Yet the space could be so much more better used to have people come in with comfortable sofas and plug in, use the Wi-Fi, and almost like mini malls inside a store. Retail hospitality and taking cues from the hospitality industry, or Starbucks or WeWork, is something that I would have expected to see more of. Have you seen people trying to turn their stores into a workspace for customers to come and hang out, and maybe they'll buy something if they hang out for an hour? Maybe something catches their fancy.
I've seen a lot of really interesting ideas, but probably more ideas than implementation at this point. I've seen companies, like Shopify, I think is a really innovative, fresh company. It's exploring all sorts of ideas. I see some of the developers, I think Mesa Rich is an example of really looking at how to rethink, amazingly located properties, like a Tyson's or Santa Monica, and think of them more as neighborhoods and communities rather than as malls that are somehow isolated by other activities. But I think most of them will tell you that the dearth or the barrier is coming from the retailers and the retail ecosystem. To some extent, I think the business of retail sort of got marked down over the last couple of years. I think it's impacted the psychology. It's impacted the investment environment. for retail. It's even affected the talent pool of people.
Yeah.
And so, part of the challenge is I think there's lots of vessels out there that are looking for exciting ingredients, and they're really challenged to find the exciting ingredients. And this sounds all gloom and doom. I apologize for that, but it's everything from literally how leasing agents are compensated for making lease deals that creates grit in the system for innovation. So having said that, my sort of ray of hope is you did an interesting interview back a few weeks ago with a gentleman from Signet, Bill Brace. If you think of a company, a legacy company, mall-based, traditional identities, segment narrowed, and then you think of that interview talking about how changing the culture was really one of the first things they were doing around how internally teams integrated new concepts, different approaches, taking that platform and sort of rethinking of it, integrating digital into the business in a fresh way. To me, that is exciting as to what can happen. Yep. We just need to see more of that.
So let's move on to the S word of sustainability, which is in some ways a really interesting quagmire that brands have to deal with, especially large companies that do hope to roll out hundreds of stores around the world, and to think at the same time about net zero carbon, net zero energy, having to work with materials that maybe are recycled or creating energy efficiency. I mean, how much of that today is truly achievable, i.e. those two versions of net zero? And how are we on the path to being able to really be mindful about how we build out these stores and these fleets maybe around the world?
I think disposability, especially irresponsible disposability, is probably the number one enemy of sustainability. It's the enemy because it lowers the value of the work of the people that make things. It lowers the value of the resources that take into account that are the raw materials that things are made out of, and then it really diminishes the value of the physical place, because physical place is also seen much like packaging as being something that's disposable, in a rapid cycle of change. We're in the process of actually putting a book together around cultural, environmental, and social sustainability. Interviewed about 150 retailers around the world, from a micro boutique in Paris to Selfridges, and what they're doing around this topic. I think a lot of the focus is moving, priorities are moving to social and cultural sustainability around what is the broader impact on people's lives, not just the environment, but the human environment, and then trying to be smarter and more sensible about how things are being spent on the physical environment. Yeah. I think you probably saw yesterday Nordstrom's announced they're starting to look at the resale market.
Yep.
A thread up to me is a really interesting retail model because it sort of slows down the cycle of disposability. Yes. VF Corp is doing some interesting things, and how that relates back to the environment is just rethinking about the cycle of environment and change. And if you think of the environment being less disposable and something that's more changeable or renewable, that's much more focused on sustainability than the idea that every 3 to 5 to 7 years we blow it up, put it in a dumpster, and then dump it someplace.
Well, that's where I was about to go, which was the depreciation cycle of fixturing is such that you kind of have to blow something up. But the truth is, if it were someone's apartment that you just built with the same fixtures, especially at the premium end of the market, it would probably last decades, maybe 10 years, 15 years. And so it's interesting about, just the people pushing sustainability, but then they have a depreciation cycle on the financial side of the house, and reconciling the two is very hard. And so therefore maybe modular elements that can be shifted and turned and adapted and morphed, I guess, into something new, but using the same bones is probably where things are going. Have you used sort of maybe more modular items in your latest work?
In the U.S., there's still a challenge because of the nature of how we think about new and old. Where we've done this more successfully has been outside the U.S., particularly in Europe. And I think part of that is because so many of the businesses are family and generationally owned businesses that have a different point of view about the value of things in the life cycle. Build better to last longer. I think they see their spaces much more as platforms in which they refresh and renew, rather than as spaces that they destroy and throw away. But what I'm thinking is happening in the U.S. and starting the conversation is really shifting the role of the landlord, the tenant, and then the operator. And if you think of landlords building what I would call permanent temporary spaces, more infrastructure, more flexibility to that infrastructure, and the idea that because of shortening lease cycles, that there's probably going to be more variety of tenants in a given space over a shorter period of time. And the old model of basically blowing it up every 3 to 5 years doesn't economically work, and it isn't sustainable. And so what I'm seeing is there's beginning to be more thought on the part of landlords thinking about space as something that the airports are a good example where that model is quite effectively used already. Yeah, is that there's more shift, but there's more responsible shift.
Speaking of airports and you being well-traveled, we just talked about well-traveled across retail. Let's talk about well-traveled around the globe. You are, I don't know, you are one of the people who I know have traveled more than most people I've ever met. I think you've probably been to most countries that have any semblance of retail. Where have you most recently, notwithstanding the fact that you probably haven't been on a plane in a year, where have you most been inspired by maybe a small handful of places that really have got your heart racing and excited about what you saw in a few cities?
Using the term developing country is kind of a backhanded compliment to a lot of places, because in most places that we may think of as developing, whether it's Brazil or India or Mexico, there are environments in which there's much more sophistication than what we're used to. And there's much more rawness, and it very often sits next to each other. Mm-hmm. And literally, it sits on the front doorstep. The rawness may walking into a luxury environment that's as sophisticated or more sophisticated than anything you'd find in the North America. Yep. And I think that the energy of that juxtaposition is exciting in its own right. But historically, what's happened is those places, they've sort of put a guard at the door. What's exciting, we're working some interesting projects in Mexico and India right now, where they're looking at ways to really bring that energy and that sophistication into one environment. Mm. I think it's something that's probably not comfortable and natural in the U.S. And yet this last year, with so many ideas being looked at differently and in fresh ways, whether I look at the energy of urban communities and frankly, the sterility of suburban communities, and how these different communities can learn from each other and benefit each other. I see examples outside the U.S. where it's a very exciting outcome. Very few in the U.S. We talk about gentrification in the U.S. In those neighborhoods, in those developing countries, that's really not a term that people use because they're much more used to that juxtaposition and the idea that there's value in that juxtaposition versus how we typically approach when retail becomes more sophisticated and corporate, the neighborhood becomes less interesting and dynamic. Yeah. And so I think if there's a lesson to learn is how to ethically and commercially maintain that juxtaposition because in the end, it's better for everybody.
Yeah, it becomes a more human and natural environment. I mean, just having a sterile luxury mall with gates, again, you don't have the energy, you don't have people, and you come back to those store associates sitting there, whistling Dixie and not having anything to do until one customer comes in a day to make their day, right? Without the energy that comes with. And by the way, the surprising customer that will show up from actually creating the desire for them to be in a place versus some kind of temple to luxury, or retail. Right. And so one last thing before we have to wrap up, what brands / spaces, could be both, have really inspired you specifically? Again, talking about your nomadic nature, traveling across the whole industry. What brands inspire you? What spaces of those brands have inspired you recently?
I think if you using your term safari is I think if I were to draw a frame around a neighborhood. So if I look at Mexico City, and there's an area called Condesa Roma, and it's become quite popular, I think, from a Netflix or a Showtime series. Mm-hmm. And the sort of the shopping texture, of the bakery that's been there for 3 generations next to the coffee place that 2 artists opened up as a studio that allows you to be part of that studio environment, and almost a salon, which sits next to a luxury brand that sits next to a church. To me, are the places. If you're trying to say narrow it down to a store, part of the danger would be is thinking about everything a year ago. And you would talk about Selfridges, or we would talk about Dover Street Market, or we would talk about Palacio de Hierro, because they were great. They were emporiums. They weren't stores. And I would say, if you think about retail, not as a store, but as an emporium of ideas, emporium of products, emporium of activities, I think the question is going to be, what will be in the future? Who will be hosting these emporiums? Who will be in those emporiums? And then what will be the texture of the activities in those? I know I'm giving you a circular answer, but I'm hesitant to say what was good a year ago and what's going to be a year from now, and what's going to be different, because I think it has to be different. I can't imagine walking down Madison Avenue of 2 years ago and then talking about the great things on Madison Avenue in the same light.
But what I think I'm hearing you say, though, if you're describing Roma in Mexico, in Mexico City, is almost a desire to manufacture, even though in this case it's not manufactured, it's natural, manufacture a way that the main street used to be, which was more organic, and instead of having a row of 200 international brands together in one place, that they be interspersed across local, international, and even cultural elements that create, to use your term, texture, and to create authenticity and vibrancy at the same time. And so that if one is to take something away from this conversation, maybe it is, if you're building an environment, a shopping environment, a place to live for people, make sure that you surprise and delight them with things that are historically more natural to humanity in their way of shopping for the last 5,000 years versus what was maybe manufactured over the last 50.
Right. And to keep the serendipity. And this is what, when we talk about the store and the mall, the mall, we kind of got lazy. We found a template. We found, willing participants in the template, both on the store side and the customer side. and people were able to make a lot of money, pushing the go button. I don't think it's going to be so easy.
Mm-hmm.
Who is going to be the catalyst, whether it's designers or creators or entrepreneurs, to be the ones to do the hard work?
Who is going to be the catalyst? Indeed, you're going to be the catalyst, my friend. Thank you so much for joining me on the Safari. Ken Nisch, Chairman of JGA. It's always such a pleasure, and thank you so much for joining me on the Safari.
Thank you, Morty. It's been fun. It always is.
If you want to learn a little bit more about Traub, you can go to traub.io, where you'll learn a lot about everything that we do. If you're enjoying the Safari, please do share it with your friends and colleagues within the industry. And please also don't forget to subscribe and like it. Until next time.